Hello and welcome to another high-flying, crash-landing, low-selling episode of What Happened, the show where we usually wind up covering PS3 exclusives that lead to the death of their developers. And no one did PS3 exclusive and death of better than Factor 5, a massively talented studio behind some of the best Star Wars games ever made. They were also responsible for the likes of Turrican of both the Super and Mega varieties, the N64 port of Indiana Jones and the Infernal Machine, and of course, their crown jewel, Lair. Today's reptilian-like specimen will be dissecting today. Thanks again to you Flophouse VIPers for voting on this infamous title, as it harkens back to those tension-filled early days of the PS3 where everything released was the biggest gamble ever. You might wind up being the next Naughty Dog, or you might wind up being the next Factor 5. So how did this studio, with the backing of LucasArts, finagle their way into financial ruin? Well, it's a twisting tale filled with broken business deals, flaring tempers, and one of the worst mainstream motion control devices of all time, the Kinect 6-axis controllers. So, Lair, what happened? Factor 5 was founded in the greatest year of the 80s, 1987, fuck you 84, and opened its doors in Cologne, Germany, where the aforementioned Turrican series was born. The action-packed shooter caught the eye of LucasArts, who then set them to work on one of their most underrated forays into 16-bitage, Indiana Jones's greatest adventures. This was then the trigger for Factor 5 to open a second office in San Rafael, California, and was done so they could be in closer proximity with LucasArts so they could produce such classics as Rogue Squadron, Battle for Naboo, Rogue Leader, and Rebel Strike for Nintendo platforms. Rogue Leader, specifically, was cited as Factor 5's big break and is considered one of the most dazzling launch titles of all time. But Factor 5 had one more game to deliver on their initial deal with LucasArts, an enhanced compilation of Squadron, Leader, and Rebel Strike for the Xbox. In 2003, however, things changed as then LucasArts president Simon Jeffrey left the company and one Jim Ward took over. Immediately, Factor 5 felt a disturbance in the force as LucasArts reneged on that deal and the remastered package was shelved.
This deal is getting worse all the time.
Feeling they needed a different approach, the studio decided to pitch something a bit more exciting than a re-release to impress the new LucasArts bigwigs. They proposed a full-on sequel for the then upcoming Xbox 360 titled Rogue Squadron X-Wing vs. TIE Fighter. The type of moniker that would extend the lightsaber of any self-respecting Jedi. At first, all parties were enthusiastic about the idea, especially Microsoft, as it would leverage Xbox Live and feature an extensive online multiplayer suite. This was all short-lived though, as LucasArts, for some reason, got cold feet as they felt such new technology as the internet was a bit too risky for a launch title and just stopped paying Factor 5 altogether. In an interview with COLOGNE, Julian Egebrecht recalls, "We had a pay or play deal, a financial guarantee regardless of whether a project is finished, but they still just decided, we don't know about this whole launch title thing. So we told them, unless we find a way out of this, you might put our whole studio into bankruptcy." Thus, Factor 5 started searching elsewhere for a publishing partner, although one particular avenue in their eyes wasn't even an option. Nintendo had given Factor 5 a sneak peek into what they were cooking up with the Wii, a console that heavily favored new input methods and controllers rather than processing power. In a move that's strangely reminiscent of Silicon Knights, Factor 5 felt this approach spelt doom and or gloom for Nintendo, and thus didn't really entertain the idea of working on the underpowered console. This is where Sony swoops in. Since they were pretty much the only other game in town, Julian Egebrecht pitched what would hopefully be a new IP, a World War I inspired turn-based title that featured both land and air action, but in a twist, starred a menagerie of characters plucked from the animal kingdom. Animal Wars impressed Sony and was subsequently greenlit as Factor 5's first PS3 project. There was just one problem, however. The much larger team whose work had stalled on Star Wars Xbox needed to move on to something. Thus, Egebrecht gave both Microsoft and LucasArts an ultimatum. I said, if neither of them would pay us for the Star Wars work, then we would have to go somewhere else with that half of the team. With neither willing to fit the bill, we were denied an X-Wing vs. TIE Fighter title from the makers of Rogue Goddamn Leader. Meanwhile, Sony, who cared not for Star Wars at this time, asked Factor 5 if they could fill a spot on their schedule with another new IP. Julian used his love of mythology and high fantasy to present Dragon Knight, a game that had you playing as a Leviathan-bound mercenary, circling the fields of war between two opposing factions. This conflict revolved around religious differences, and was up to the player on who to side with. You could lend your strength to the losing faction, or simply burninate the countryside, carrying the spoils of war back to your home base, or, as cited in the original pitch, your lair. The game was also intended to be fully open world, allowing players to explore a massive dynamic map at their leisure. Sony, however, had problems with some of these aspects. They were enthusiastic about the idea of riding dragons across a war-torn landscape, but were uncomfortable with the religious themes and felt the open world design was a bit too risky and ambitious. They then demanded changes to the narrative and wanted Dragon Knight, whose name of course later changed to Lair, to be a more linear, level-based affair. Julian started to become frustrated with these changes and quickly lost any passion he previously had for the project. The game he envisioned in his head was no longer what he was working on, and it was going to change even further a lot. Once in full production, and for reasons we'll soon get into, it was estimated at its peak, Lair had 140 people working on it at the same time, a high benchmark for the industry in the mid-aughts. Even with all these people, however, all that work started going incredibly slow, incredibly fast. Factor 5 still hadn't received final dev kits for the PS3 and had to make assumptions on what would be technically possible. In anticipation for this, they threw out all their old code and tools and started making a new set from scratch, which, as you can probably surmise, was a bit of a mistake. It was the single biggest mistake throughout Lair's whole development, admitted Egebrecht. Not only did we have this completely new system to learn, but we also had no base technology. That was a fundamental, really bad mistake that we made, and Sony had absolutely nothing to do with that. It was our own stupidity. Regardless, at E3 2005, the public got its first glimpse of Lair in a fancy-wancy CGI trailer that was representing a vision that wasn't even close to reality. Factor 5 were still coding and designing in the dark, with many of the staff believing that once they got the final dev kits, the PS3 would be a breeze to build actual games for. It wasn't. They had greatly overestimated the power and user friendliness of the architecture, so they had to reassess just about everything. Technical artist David Cohen joined the team around this time and had to deal with the brunt of it as it was happening. Factor 5 did a couple of tests early on, and they thought, oh wow, this PS3, it's gonna look just like the movies no matter what. We don't need to optimize anything if we just go full film assets. Then we had to start bringing everything down to what could actually be done on a PS3. This setback caused a lack of forward momentum, which was a constant theme throughout Lair's entire developmental lifecycle. After the E3 showing, level designer Mark Wilhelm joined the team in October of that year and was shown a brief prototype. I was like, oh wow, you guys really made progress. And then I was like, show me the rest of it. And they're like, no, that's all we have. And I was like, is there any way I can go on to Animal Wars? That looks so cool. The stuff with Lair was like, not that many people were very excited about it.
I fear this is only the beginning.
Now, despite being at E3 that year, Factor 5 was not contacted to supply anything Rare related in 2006 for Sony's now epic E3 presser, as I suppose there was no room between sad-looking rhinos and
Ridge Racer! Remember that one?
The Factor 5 team were instead watching Sony's conference online to see if Lair would get a mention. They did show off an action-based flight game, but it would be Warhawk instead, and with it, their new, totally original 6-axis controller. We were laughing about it at first, and then it dawned on us, shit, Sony is gonna make us use this. Now, here is where some reports differ. Julian Egebrecht claims that Sony pushed the 6-axis on them as a mandatory feature. The marketing department said, we need one game to really show off this stuff, and the Warhawk team, isn't enthusiastic about it. They don't want to do it. Could you guys do it? They put a ton of pressure on us and said, you have to be the showcase motion controlled title. You'll figure out how it works. Then head of Sony Europe, Phil Harrison, denied this in 2007, saying it was definitely not mandated by us. We've always said all along that the use of the 6-axis is something that should be decided by the developer in tune with their creative vision for the game, so it's not something we would mandate. So the truth, as it usually is, lies somewhere in between. The actual facts, though, were pretty clear. Lair shipped with mandatory motion controls at launch, despite the team's misgivings, and Warhawk did not. Now, while the 6-axis was okay for basic movements, controlling an entire vehicle, or Tragon in this case, it was not very okay at all. The technology was hastily thrown together as a countermeasure to Nintendo's Wiimote and was now being forced onto a title it was never designed for. Julian Egebrecht, for his part, thought they could at least alter Lair enough in its controls and aiming so it would be a better fit for motion. I thought that motion controls could work for Lair in the sense that if we loosen up the game to not need as much pinpoint accuracy as Rogue Squadron, then you could forgive certain stuff with the motion controls. In hindsight, it was stupid to think that. This unfortunately didn't result in the 6-axis being any easier to design for, or play with for that matter. Joe Spataro, a designer, summed up how the whole team felt. All of the staff were unanimous that we didn't like the motion controls and it wasn't how the game was meant to be played. We ended up shipping it that way and none of us were happy. As previously mentioned, Julian became frustrated with Lair early on in its planning phase, so you can imagine how he's feeling when it was delayed an additional year, as it simply wasn't ready for the PS3 launch. This was in conjunction with the director's personal life, as he was going through a messy divorce and custody battle during Lair's development. This regrettably led Julian to lose his cool in front of the team a number of times, with one Joe Pinney even quitting the company before Lair's completion, saying Egebrecht occasionally lost his temper and verbally abused other people. It wasn't a healthy place to work. Speaking of Polygon, Julian admits, I was trying desperately to rally the mission design team around the vision I had in my head. I got extremely frustrated relatively early on because unfortunately the guys weren't getting it. There were definitely 1 or 2 meetings where I lost my temper simply out of frustration. On top of all of this, Factor 5's new level design tools weren't making things any easier and are often cited as one of the main problems that impacted development. The entire staff felt that the new tool set was clunky, slow, and prone to crashes, which isn't a surprise as it was quickly thrown together to make way for the PS3. I had 1 week where the game would crash immediately when you started, said Spataro. Then suddenly, this kid rewrote the whole level editor by himself. He implemented all the features we wanted and more. He's like the secret hero that allowed the game to ship at all. He's referring to one Andy Vella, a fresh graduate from the DigiPen School of Design, who was, shall we say, shocked when he first sat down to work on Lair. Recognizing that the level tools were a root cause for Factor 5's glacial progress, he did indeed rewrite everything from scratch, alleviating a lot of headaches. Speaking of headaches, Factor 5 were in for some more, because despite it progressing better than Lair, Animal Wars was due to have its own set of disasters. The idea of cuddly creatures fighting each other in an intense and bloody affair started to raise concerns within Sony's marketing team. Since Lair had already proven to be an expensive venture, Sony decided to simply cut their losses and just canceled Animal Wars outright in August of 2006. This is a critical point in the studio's overall history, as the loss of one title put even more pressure on the remaining one to perform. And unfortunately, that remaining one was Lair. So after a bunch of long hours, all the cards were on the table come August 31st, 2007. Concerns at Factor 5 were kinda high when several press outlets began contacting them asking if there was any incoming patch that would add traditional controls before they published their reviews. Julian explained that the whole disaster could have been avoided. Within 1 day, we had the patch ready because we only had to activate it. We begged Sony, don't make this mistake. This is going to go terribly wrong. If every single publication right now is telling us they're going to throw us under the bus, well then please do this. Sony said no. Predictably, in many online sites and magazines, Lair was labeled as one of the most disappointing games of the year, with many agreeing the inability to actually control your dragon was the main issue. Instead of authorizing the patch, however, Sony decided to innovate by issuing a Lair reviewer guide, which gave detailed instructions on how to handle the motion controls. Now, short fact sheets are a common inclusion when review copies are shipped to the press, but this was a 21-page guide on how to play the game. All of Factor 5 was aghast, as all the review guide did was just beat the dead dragon even further.
Stop! Stop! He's already dead.
Please look at my medical alert bracelet.
Julian theorized as to why Sony held back the patch that might have circumvented all of this. The reviewer's guide was in this whole quagmire of us trying to push the patch out, whereas Sony's marketing reaction to the whole thing was, no, let's not do it with a patch and admit that something's wrong. Let's teach these folks how to really play it, which of course probably backfired 20 times over. Which, wasn't really true, as it actually backfired 50 times over instead. Lair came and went without much fanfare and was completely outclassed by a variety of titles released within the very same week and some change. Metroid Prime 3, BioShock, Heavenly Sword, Blue Dragon, and even the other PS3 exclusive flight sim Warhawk was released just days earlier. Lair was doomed to fail. But then, 7 months later, the patch was finally released, adding DualShock 3 Rumble, analog stick support, several free dragon mounts, and a whole stinking pile of too little too late.
So much has been destroyed. It'll never be the same.
It shouldn't come as a surprise, but Sony did not re-up their deal with Factor 5, so they were forced to, once again, look for a publishing partner. This is when they tried to return to the loving embrace of Nintendo, but none of their projects or pitches ever worked out in the end. Behind closed doors, the team were even able to put together a fully playable and near-complete Rogue Squadron compilation game for the Wii. They were able to max out the 2 duct-tape GameCubes and had their classics looking better than ever. Unfortunately though, LucasArts wasn't interested, and the Rogue Squadron compilation fell to the wayside once again. Desperate to use their flight sim experience, they even tried pitching a darker take on Kid Icarus to Nintendo, which sadly never got past the prototyping phase. During all of this failure, Factor 5 were able to procure one more project and had begun working on it, a game based on the then upcoming sequel to Superman Returns that never came out. Well, the movie never came out, so the game obviously didn't. What happened fodder, Brash Entertainment, were publishing the title before they went bankrupt for literally thousands of reasons. So, with Superman cancelled, the US branch of Factor 5 officially went into liquidation in early 2009. The remaining German office, which specialized in software tools, lingered on in an administrative capacity. Former staff at Factor 5 US, though, then filed a suit against Julian Egebrecht for unpaid wages during this time, which was, thankfully, settled not too long after. Then, in February of this year, Liam Robertson of Unseen64 uncovered the fact that Julian Egebrecht had suddenly been hired by Epic Games in a directorial role, but no further information has surfaced since. Now, unlike a lot of CEOs or directors we've profiled here at What Happened, Mr. Egebrecht acknowledges his obvious role in his own company's downfall. I was in the bad spot of having an unhealthy ego as well as my personal stuff going on at the time, so I'm probably the most to blame because I'm also the director. Certainly a bit more refreshing than Brendan McNamara claiming that unpaid overtime and employee burnout is simply just unavoidable. Regardless, it's still sad when such a skilled group of people simply make ill-advised moves, bet on the wrong horses, or shack up with partners that never truly valued them and their talent, and Factor 5 went through it all. So while Lair, their first and last PS3 game, didn't burn the studio to the ground per se, it certainly brought them up to some dizzying highs and terrifying lows. If you know of any other examples of lofty ambitions met with disastrous consequences, light up the comments below or join the Flophouse VIP Patreon to cast your vote for the next subject we set our sights on. See you next time, and thanks for watching.